With that, I'm now happy to introduce our last speaker of the day, Dr. Michael Kent, who is our very own program manager for the Catalyze program. Mike is a scientific program manager with over 10 years of experience in program management, quality management, and process engineering. His background is very diverse and includes both chemical and biochemical engineering, as well as a business side. So Mike, I'm super pleased to introduce you and give you the virtual mic.
Thank you very much, Marissa. And let me just get my screen share going. All righty. Appreciate that. So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mike Ken, and I work in the program management office, as Marissa mentioned. It's my pleasure to support Mike Peck and the Catalyze program. And I was really excited to be invited to share a little bit about project risk management with you all this afternoon. And preparing for this talk, I really designed this presentation with two key objectives in mind. Given that we only have 30 minutes, I wanted to make sure I was able to provide a nice but detailed primer on what formal risk management entails. And I also wanted to make sure that I was able to share some tips that hopefully all of you will be able to implement really easily into your Catalyze projects. And to kind of kick things off, what I'd like to do is just focus on three quick questions to kind of make sure we have a baseline understanding of what risk and risk management entails. The first is, as you can see on the screen, what is risk? In layman's terms, we consider risk to be something bad that might happen in the future. But in the context of project management, risk can either be a negative or a positive thing. And so when we think about then risk management, what we're really talking about is the acts of planning for, monitoring, and controlling both those negative risks, which we refer to as threats, or positive risks, which we'd refer to as opportunities. And given the specific circumstances of your projects, including various constraints and your team's risk appetite, ultimately you're going to try and come up with an optimal response for how you tackle those risks, all to ultimately try and achieve project success. Now, the third question, which may be on many of your minds, is so what? Like, why should you care? How can risk management benefit your Catalyze project team? And the truth of the matter is there are a whole load of potential benefits for doing risk management. By going through the processes, you are inevitably going to identify strengths and weaknesses that your team can build upon. You'll certainly be able to anticipate challenges. You'll be able to prioritize all of your different risks that you're working on, the things that matter most. And that's just 3 out of many other potential benefits doing risk management, all hopefully culminating in reducing your time to market and you hopefully improving the lives of patients in the heart, lung, blood, and sleep space. And I think it's one thing to note is that whether you know it or not, we're all ultimately actually doing risk management to some degree. It is one of the underpinnings of the Catalyze program. It's part of the reason why the amazing folks in the Catalyze Coordinating Center draft product development plans for each Catalyze team at the onset of their award. It's part of the reason why all of our awards are milestone driven and why we strongly encourage you throughout your time in the program to identify and really keep track of project risks. And that's a large reason why we ask you about those risks before every quarterly meeting. And so whether you know it or not, you're all engaged in risk management to some degree, but we can still potentially take a more active role and find room to grow, if you will. And so just looking at these 4 items here, when it comes to PDPs, it's important to remember these aren't static documents. They're meant to be living documents that are updated as you progress through your project, and they can be a great source of potential risks or ways to identify gaps. When it comes to identifying risks, it's really important to think about threats to your project milestones, but we encourage you to think beyond your milestones. Think about the market that you may be trying to enter, or fundraising related risks, or your regulatory pathway. Really think beyond just risks to your project milestones. And just keep in mind throughout this talk that risk management, as with project management, are very much a continuous process. And the last thing I'd like to note here is that during quarterly meetings and even in between them, please reach out to the team, the Catalyze Coordinating team, or even myself. And if you have concerns about different risks that you've identified, if you need some help navigating those risks, it's part of what we're here for. And with all that background information out of the way, I think we can now delve into what formal risk management entails, and hopefully pick up some tips that'll prove useful for all of you in your Catalyze projects. I'd be remiss if I didn't begin though by showing this diagram, which is a bit of an eye chart, I know, but to any project managers on the Catalyze teams, this diagram is likely pretty familiar, and it's what my talk is structured around. It's the framework for project risk management that is published by the PMI, the Project Management Institute, and it's comprised of 6 processes, which at a high level are pretty intuitive. You begin by defining your risk management strategy, you proceed with identifying risks, evaluating them, and coming up with sort of ranking or prioritization, before you then come up with a risk response plan, and ultimately you control your risk. And there are a number of benefits to this general framework, including how comprehensive it is, the fact that it's widely used across many different industries, and it's adaptable, not just to Catalyze projects, but to even much larger projects as well. But you can tell just by looking at it, with all the different inputs, outputs, the tools and techniques that are listed, it can be a bit much to digest. It's a bit unwieldy, and it takes some training and experience to get used to it. But it doesn't mean that it's not important and not useful. And so what I'd like to do, and I should also mention that this is one of the reasons why we recommend having someone dedicated on your team who can help with your project management and your risk management endeavors, because it really is a lot to sort of manage, to document, and keep track of. But still, over the next 20 or so minutes, what I'd like to do is summarize just the key things you need to know about the individual processes within risk management, and also how to hopefully implement it for your projects. And so we'll start at the top with planning risk management. The first step here is to really just plan and spell out how you and your team intend to manage risk. And this is something that you'll want to document so that the expectations are really clear for your team, and so you can go back and reference these documents later on if needed. And there isn't really a one-size-fits-all approach to this. Your risk management plan should take into consideration the specifics of your project and team. As far as who should be involved in putting together the plan, ideally, the person who's most experienced with the risk management on your team should take the lead, and that's very often a project manager. But even though they may be the ones who are leading the charge, it's still really important to engage others on the project team. That's so you can get a really robust sort of strategy in place, and so you can get buy-in from different stakeholders, so that once you ultimately approve and implement the plan, people are actually adhering to it and they really buy into it. You'll also want to understand your risk appetite. What are acceptable levels of risk for your team when it comes to cost, when it comes to quality or safety metrics of your product? This is really important because it's going to influence how and when you respond to risks, and what your threshold is for a risk that needs to be addressed versus those that you can kind of just sit back and passively monitor. As far as when to get started, I mean, the short answer is it's the sooner the better. It's technically never too late to get started, but if you want to get the most benefit out of this, to be able to recognize opportunities that you can exploit or to avoid certain risks, negative risks, you want to get started sooner than later. And now's as perfect time as any to get started. As far as how to actually get started, you can adopt an existing framework like the one we're discussing now. You can utilize lessons learned from past projects if you've worked on similar projects or products in the future. But 2 things are really for certain. You need to develop this plan, this overall risk management strategy or plan collaboratively, and you need to document. Now, as far as what actually goes into your risk management plan and these series of documents, I'm promise you this will be more clear as we go through the subsequent processes, but just in case you're wondering, some of the components that you're going to want to think about are not just your methodology for how you identify risks and evaluate them, but also who on your team is responsible for what. How does your budget and schedule integrate with your overall plan? How do you rate a high risk versus a low risk? What does that mean? When are you reporting these things? there are a number of different components, but for now, let's just assume that we have come up with a solid risk management plan and we're ready to start identifying risks. So in the identify risk stage, if you will, you're trying to proactively identify as many risks as you can, and then you'll proceed with evaluating them, prioritizing them, and ultimately responding to them. And I strongly encourage you to avoid the temptation of identifying one risk and then immediately evaluating it and coming up with a strategy. Trust the process. First, come up with a nice, thorough list of potential risks, compile them in a risk register, and then follow the step and eventually move on to evaluating those risks. Now, here, similar to how in planning risk management, you involve one or two or a few core people. When it comes to identifying risks, you really want everybody on your team to be a part of this. It needs to be a part of your team's culture. And you should also consider reaching out to external stakeholders because they can help you identify potential opportunities or potential threats. So when you're having your customer discovery interviews or you're talking with potential venture capitalists or whoever you're reaching out to, just keep your eyes open and ears open for potential opportunities and threats. Keep in mind that this identify risk stage, it's very much an iterative process. The initial round will likely be the hardest and the longest because you want to come up with that comprehensive list. But after then, you're really kind of just maintaining it and looking to see if there's anything that needs to be added or can drop off. But just keep in mind, it's really an iterative process. And so you'll want to establish some sort of cadence or rhythm to when you revisit your risks. And as far as where to look, I can't say it enough. Be comprehensive, look everywhere, and think beyond just your Catalyze milestones. Now, I'd like to spend just a few minutes actually talking about how to actually go about thoroughly identifying risks. And I'll do this by going through 4 tools that you can apply, the first of which is pretty obvious, and that's starting with some checklists. Now, this can be a template that you found in a publication or online. It can be, a list that you kind of penned together from past experience, but it's just a nice way to kind of get started and get the ball rolling. Just keep in mind that no checklist or template that you find online is going to be specific to your team, and it's certainly not going to be exhaustive. Almost certainly, you're going to need to do some amount of brainstorming. And now that we're all kind of familiar with Mural and these online collaborative software or tools, I've kind of got a mock-up here that I want to show you. I find this to be one of the best and most engaging ways to do risk brainstorming. And so if you can imagine that this is your Mural canvas and you've got different electronic Post-it notes, the goal, let's say there's 4 of you on your team who are sitting down to do some brainstorming. You're going to want to spend, say, 10, 15 minutes putting one risk on each of these little virtual Post-it notes, and every member of the team will have a different color. And if you give yourself, say, 10 or 15 minutes, just quietly come up with as many risks as you can that can have either a positive or negative impact on your project, and just jot those down in silence. After that time's up, you can work together as a team to start organizing them to see, okay, hey, we're starting to see a theme here. Here are some different risk categories. We've got one that are concerns about funding, another about this technical issue. And this is a really nice and organic way to come up with many risks and risk categories for you to consider from the bottom up. Alternatively, you can start with the risks and then do some brainstorming to ultimately come up with even more risks. But either way you do it, I strongly recommend brainstorming, and I'm sure that many of you are already doing activities like this. I think using Mural or Miro or other software or tools like that can be really helpful. Just make sure after you do this fun exercise that you take the time to document everything that you did, and don't forget about that. 2 other tools I'd like to share. One is a SWOT analysis, and these are very often used to consider the business context or business risks. And so for those who aren't familiar, a SWOT diagram, it's pretty simple. It's a 2x2 matrix, and it consists of strengths and weaknesses, which are internal to your team, as well as opportunities and threats, which are more external forces. And so you're documenting strengths that could be IP that you have, or maybe expertise, really strong expertise in doing some sort of animal study. Weaknesses could be lack of funding or not having the bandwidth to take on all of this work, and concerns about a schedule. Opportunities could be a new market that you might be able to tap into or new funding sources, and threats can be competition who recently put out a very similar product as what you're trying to put out now. SWOT diagrams are very often put in the appendix of pitch that you'll have to potential funding sources, but it's also something that's a really nice way to think about potential risks for you to consider in this whole risk management process. And the last tool that I'll briefly share is a fishbone diagram. These are also referred to as Ishikawa diagrams or cause and effect diagrams. And they're essentially sort of cute, focused ways of doing risk identification. And they're very often, for those who are working on devices or come from a manufacturing background, these are very often used for root cause determination or root cause investigations. And so the idea here is you've got some sort of main issue or concern that you have, and you want to identify what are potential risks that can feed into that or potential root causes. And so each bone of the fish is a category of issue or threat that you may have. If you follow the 6M methodology, which I'm more familiar with, the 6M stand for the methods or processes that you have, materials that are involved in your process, different measurements that you take, machine or equipment that you use. Mother Nature stands for like environmental considerations, for example, clean room, clean air quality, the access to different patients and hospitals that you might have, other environmental conditions. And then human are like man-made concerns like training and expertise of your personnel. But long story short, you can use the fishbone diagram to identify potential risks, which are kind of shown here by these additional lines, and then ultimately determine, okay, these are some actual potential threats or opportunities related to our main issue here. This is something that we want to potentially evaluate further. And so once you've kind of gone through the brainstorming process or your SWOT analysis, at the end of the day, what you're trying to get to is just a really comprehensive spreadsheet, ideally with dozens and dozens of potential risks. You want to have a very detailed description in the first column, a couple of categories to help you, filter through these later on, and a unique identifier so it's very easy for you to track these risks as you kind of go through the process. So let's say we're done with our initial round of identifying risks. We can now proceed with actually evaluating them or analyzing them. And so during this step, what we're trying to do is to determine the impact that these different risks have and ultimately come up with a prioritization. And so what I've shown here is just a mock-up of what this might look like, taking the same risks I've just identified and kind of shown hypothetically that we've evaluated each of these risks based on the impact to the project, just using a very simple low, medium, high rating, as well as the likelihood or probability that this risk may occur. And by just changing these categorical labels to numerical scale and taking the product, that's how you arrive at the risk priority number on the far right. And this is a real simple way for you to identify what the high priority risks are. Now, I strongly recommend that your team all teams establish a risk scoring criteria before you actually sit down to do this exercise. It's to ensure that if two people evaluate the same risk, they're going to come up with a very similar risk score. And it's to kind of remove any bias that different people have, because your business lead might think one thing is a high risk and your regulatory person might think something very different. And so in order to do that, when it comes to impact, here's a mock-up of something that I've kind of done in the past. The numbers here are just, again, just for demonstration purposes. You'll want to kind of fill in what makes sense for you and your specific project. But you can, instead of just using low, medium, high, evaluate all of your risks based on very low to very high, and you can look at it on different dimensions. The impact to schedule, to cost, to quality, to safety. And that could be safety of your personnel. It can be safety to the end user or the patient, whatever makes sense for that particular risk. And so recommend thinking about this early on during the planned risk management stage, and then ultimately employing it when it comes time to evaluate all of your different risks. If you're looking at just two different dimensions, impact versus likelihood, you'll have a matrix like this. And shown here is just a linear color scale, green being good, something you can kind of ignore, red being something that probably needs your attention. Evaluating risks in this way is not very practical. What you'll often see is folks is defining clear thresholds. Say anything that's a 15 or higher, it's a risk that our company or our team is not comfortable with. It's something that we need to spend more time evaluating and potentially mitigating. And then anything here that's a 6 or below is something that we can just kind of monitor but not worry about. On the other hand, if your team is really risk averse, you may need to kind of skew things differently and say, you know what, anything that's a very high impact is something that requires attention. So this is kind of risk analysis in a nutshell. Just a few quick reminders before I move on. Please establish this scoring criteria in advance. Involve your entire project team in doing this evaluation, and keep your documents updated. Things may change over time as you get more information and more experience, but just kind of keep things documented. So now, once we've identified all of our risks, we've evaluated them, we know which ones are the ones we need to tackle first, we can actually proceed with planning our risk responses. And at this point, if you haven't done so already, it's where you assign an owner, ideally just one owner, to the different risks. And those owners are responsible for taking the lead on proposing an optimal response strategy, taking into consideration the various factors of your project, like the risk appetite we just discussed, budget, schedule, and cost constraints, among others. And when it comes to managing or responding to negative risks or threats, there really are just 4 types of responses you can have. You can avoid the threat, which is not the same as ignoring the threat. On the contrary, you're avoiding the threat by taking an action to either completely eliminate that threat or to significantly lessen its impact. And examples might be to completely change a requirement to avoid some sort of concern, or affording yourself more time to really squash some potential risk. An alternative approach is to transfer that threat. This is what we often do when we hire a CMO or a CRO or a consultant to kind of take ownership of a particular task that maybe we don't have the time or expertise to handle ourselves. So that's another viable approach for different risks. Mitigating is the third strategy, which is it's pretty similar to avoid. It's just to a lesser extent. Here, you're just kind of dampening the effect of a risk should that risk actually be realized. And finally, you can throw your hands up and say, you know what? If this risk occurs, we'll deal with it at that point. We're not going to deal with it now. Maybe it's not a big issue, and we might just set aside a little bit of a contingency reserve or a budget to deal with it if and when it happens. So really, you have 4 different options to choose from when it comes to managing a negative risk. And when it comes to opportunities, you have 4 very similar options. You can, instead of avoiding, you're going to try and exploit that opportunity. Instead of transferring the risk, you're going to share it with another partner. And you can also enhance or, again, accept that risk. And that's risk response in a nutshell. And it leads us into our final risk management process, and incidentally, the last slide of my talk, controlling the risk. At this point, you really are just following your game plan and implementing those risk responses based on your budget and the schedule. And you're also, now that you're getting more information, collecting more data, you're better able to identify new risks, including risks that you may have unintentionally created the possibility for based on all those risk responses that you've just enacted. You'll also want to maintain communication with all of your relevant stakeholders, because again, with all these different risk responses you're putting into place, things could be changing pretty quickly. If you're changing an entire requirement of your product or a study, for example, you want to make sure that you get kind of buy-in to folks and that you're disseminating that information in 2 ways. You'll also want to periodically audit your team's adherence to the risk management process, especially since you spent so much time and effort to define it. You want to make sure that people are following it in order to get the best benefit, and also checking to see that you're actually getting the benefits that you expect, that it's being effective for you. And lastly, what I want to note is that as much as this is kind of a structured approach, it's still important to be flexible, to understand that things may change over time, and the risk management process, this protocol or this framework, allows for that. You're getting more information, your needs may change, your budget may change. So it's okay to kind of go back and to revise your overall strategy or to change your risk appetite. Again, just do so by involving key stakeholders and disseminating that information to your team. And I know that was a lot to kind of discuss. There's a lot more that we could potentially discuss, but I really hope that this will be helpful to your team. This is project risk management in a nutshell. And in the 4 or so minutes that we have left, I'd be happy to answer any questions. And if after you kind of sit and digest all this information, if you have any questions in the future, please feel free to reach out to me and certainly reach out to the amazing staff of the coordinating centers, your project technical lead and your project manager. We're all really here to help you. And risk management is a big part of that. And so I'm happy to take any questions at this time.